The year was 800 CE. While Europe stumbled through what it would later call the Dark Ages, a different world was being born, not through conquest alone, but through something far more dangerous to history's carefully curated narrative: knowledge. Baghdad had just become the intellectual center of the known world. The Abbasid Caliphate, stretching from Spain to India, wasn't just building mosques and palaces, it was constructing the largest repository of human knowledge the world had ever seen. The House of Wisdom, they called it. And what happened within those walls over the next 5 centuries would quietly shape every aspect of modern science, from the phone in your pocket to the medicine that keeps you alive. But here's what they don't teach you. The systematic erasure of this legacy wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, methodical, and astonishingly successful. Let's start with something simple. The numbers you're reading right now, 1, 2, 3, we call them Arabic numerals. Europe adopted them in the 13th century, revolutionizing mathematics, commerce, and engineering. Before that, try doing long division with Roman numerals. Actually don't. It's a nightmare. But here's the thing, those numbers weren't originally Arabic either. They came from India. So why do we call them Arabic numerals? Because Islamic scholars didn't just preserve them, they refined them, systematized them, and transmitted them to a Europe that was still counting on its fingers. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi wrote the book that would change mathematics forever. Literally, his name gave us the word algorithm. His work, the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing, gave us something else: algebra. The word itself comes from al-jabr, one of the operations he described. This wasn't just theoretical noodling. Al-Khwarizmi was solving inheritance disputes, calculating tax obligations, and designing irrigation systems. Math that actually did something. Math that built empires. The House of Wisdom operated on a principle that seems almost alien today. Translation first, innovation second. Caliph al-Ma'mun didn't just want Islamic texts, he wanted everything: Greek philosophy, Persian astronomy, Indian mathematics, Chinese medicine. Scholars were paid the weight of their translations in gold. Think about that incentive structure for a moment. Within decades, they had Euclid, Ptolemy, Aristotle, Galen. All the classical knowledge that Europe had lost or abandoned was now being preserved, studied, and expanded in Arabic. But preservation was never the goal. Transformation was. Take astronomy. When Islamic scholars looked at Ptolemy's Almagest, they didn't just copy it reverently. They tested it. They built observatories in Baghdad, Damascus, and Samarkand that made European instruments look like children's toys. Al-Battani's measurements of the solar year were accurate to within 2 minutes. In the 9th century, the astrolabe, that intricate brass instrument that looks like steampunk jewelry, became the smartphone of the medieval Islamic world. It told time, determined prayer direction, calculated celestial positions, and aided navigation. European sailors would later use Islamic astrolabes to discover the new world. The irony should not be lost. But let's talk about something that hits closer to home: medicine. When you take antibiotics, thank Ibn Sina. When a surgeon washes their hands before operating, thank Al-Zahrawi. When you receive anesthesia, thank the Islamic medical tradition that pioneered its use. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine in the 11th century. It remained the standard medical textbook in European universities until the 1600s, 600 years. This wasn't a primitive guide to bloodletting. This was systematic anatomy, pharmacology, and clinical observation that recognized contagious diseases, described meningitis, and understood that contaminated water spreads illness. Al-Zahrawi invented over 200 surgical instruments. Many are still in use today, virtually unchanged. He performed the first thyroidectomy, the first tracheotomy. His 30-volume medical encyclopedia included detailed illustrations of surgical procedures that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. The question that should be forming in your mind right now is obvious. If Islamic civilization was so advanced, why doesn't everyone know this? The answer involves several convenient historical rewrites. But before we get there, you need to understand just how deep this knowledge went, because what we've covered so far barely scratches the surface. While Europe was still debating how many angels could dance on a pin, Islamic scholars were doing something radical. They were insisting that knowledge required proof, not just logical proof, but experimental proof, evidence you could see, measure, and reproduce. Ibn al-Haytham, working in 11th century Cairo, basically invented the scientific method. His Book of Optics didn't just theorize about light, he conducted experiments. He built camera obscuras. He understood that light travels in straight lines, that vision involves light entering the eye rather than emanating from it, and he calculated the atmospheric refraction of light with stunning accuracy. He also did something that would become foundational to all future science. He admitted when he was wrong. He revised his theories based on experimental evidence. He demanded that others verify his results. This wasn't philosophy. This was science. European universities would later translate his work into Latin and teach it for centuries. They just didn't emphasize who wrote it. The author became Al-Hazen, a Latinized name that obscured his origin. This pattern would repeat itself countless times. Chemistry owes its existence to Jabir ibn Hayyan, not alchemy, which was about turning lead into gold. Actual chemistry, distillation, crystallization, dissolution, evaporation. He isolated acids, studied their properties, and laid the groundwork for modern chemical processes. The word alchemy itself comes from Arabic, al-kimia, the chemistry. Geography was being rewritten. Al-Idrisi created world maps for the Norman king of Sicily that were the most accurate of the medieval period. Muhammad al-Idrisi's Tabula Rogeriana showed the world in remarkable detail, based on reports from travelers, merchants, and explorers across the Islamic world. But maps required something else, mathematics sophisticated enough to handle spherical geometry and astronomical calculations. Enter the scholars who refined trigonometry, developed spherical trigonometry, and created the mathematical tools that would eventually enable European exploration. Here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean deliberately obscured. When European scholars finally began emerging from their intellectual drought in the 12th and 13th centuries, where did they go to learn? Toledo, Cordoba, Sicily, anywhere that Islamic and European culture intersected. They didn't go to learn from ancient Greeks. They went to learn from living Islamic scholars and to translate Arabic texts. The Renaissance that Europe celebrates as its reawakening didn't spring from nowhere. It was built on translations of Islamic texts, which themselves contained and expanded upon Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge. But the narrative that emerged later was different. The story became about Europeans rediscovering their classical heritage. The Islamic middle step was quietly edited out. Gerard of Cremona alone translated 87 books from Arabic into Latin, Ibn Sina's canon, Al-Khwarizmi's algebra, Al-Razi's medical texts. These became the curriculum of European universities, Oxford, Paris, Bologna, all teaching from Arabic sources, often without acknowledging it. The pattern is everywhere once you start looking. Copernicus's revolutionary model of the solar system, built on mathematical techniques developed by Islamic astronomers at the Maragay Observatory. He didn't cite them, but the mathematical fingerprints are undeniable. The tools of navigation that enabled European exploration, astrolabes and mathematical tables developed in the Islamic world. The financial instruments that enabled European banking, based on systems developed by Muslim merchants. Even the university system itself owes a debt to the madrasa model. The idea of granting degrees, of having endowed institutions of learning, of systematic curricula, these weren't European inventions. But somewhere between the 15th and 19th centuries, a narrative solidified. Science was a European achievement. The ancient Greeks invented it, Europeans revived it, and everyone else was a footnote. This wasn't just bad history, it was strategic amnesia. The reasons are tangled. Religious prejudice played a role. How could infidels have contributed to Christian Europe's glory? Colonial attitudes made it convenient to portray Islamic civilization as backward and in need of Western enlightenment. And frankly, admitting that your Renaissance was jump-started by the people you were now colonizing created uncomfortable questions. What's remarkable is how thoroughly this erasure worked. Ask someone to name a great scientist from the Islamic Golden Age. Watch them struggle. Ask them to name a Greek philosopher or a Renaissance inventor. Watch them rattle off a list. This wasn't because Islamic scholars were less important. It was because their importance was systematically downplayed, their names Latinized beyond recognition, and their contributions attributed to the vague category of ancient wisdom, rather than specific identifiable human beings who lived, worked, and revolutionized their fields. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was destroyed by the Mongols in 1258. The Tigris River reportedly ran black with ink from the books thrown into it. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, gone in days. But that wasn't the end of Islamic science. Scholarship continued in Cairo, in Samarkand, in Istanbul, in Cordoba. What ended it wasn't invasion. It was a slow strangulation of institutional support, combined with European colonization that imposed new systems and dismissed existing ones as primitive. By the 19th century, the very civilizations that had once led the world in science were being told by European colonizers that they needed to be taught how to think. The greatest trick wasn't making Islamic contributions disappear. It was making people forget they had ever existed in the first place. That erasure didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, like watching a photograph fade in sunlight. First the details blur, then the faces become unrecognizable. Eventually you forget there was ever an image there at all. Start with language. When Al-Khwarizmi's treatise on calculation reached Europe, his name was mangled into algorithm, which became algorithm. The man disappeared. The technique remained, credited to no one in particular. Algebra comes from al-jaba, literally, the reunion of broken parts, from the title of his book. But ask someone where algebra came from, and they'll probably say math class, not a 9th century scholar in Baghdad. Or take chemistry. The word itself comes from alchemia, the Arabic term for the practice. Europeans learned distillation, crystallization, and experimental methods from Arabic texts. Then they called it their own science and dismissed Arabic alchemy as mystical nonsense. Never mind that the equipment in European laboratories, the alembics and retorts, were Arabic inventions. Never mind that the experimental method itself was articulated by Ibn al-Haytham centuries before Francis Bacon supposedly invented it. This wasn't just about words, it was about power. Knowledge is currency, and acknowledging where your wealth came from means sharing credit. Easier to pretend you earned it all yourself. Look at astronomy. Europeans called the brightest stars by Arabic names: Aldebaran, Rigel, Deneb, Betelgeuse. These weren't translations, these were direct borrowings, because Islamic astronomers had catalogued the sky with unprecedented precision. They built observatories when Europe was still arguing about whether stars were holes in a celestial sphere. But textbooks teach Copernicus and Galileo as revolutionary geniuses who overturned ancient ignorance. The centuries of Islamic astronomical work that made their breakthroughs possible, footnote at best, usually nothing. The pattern repeats in medicine. Medieval European physicians used translations of Ibn Sina's Canon as their primary textbook for 600 years. 600 years. It was literally the most influential medical text in Western history. His section on infectious diseases described contagion through invisible particles, essentially germ theory, in the 11th century. Europe wouldn't accept that idea until the 19th. But medical history tends to skip from Galen to Vesalius, as if nothing happened in between, as if Ibn Sina, Al-Razi, and Ibn al-Nafis, who correctly described pulmonary circulation 3 centuries before William Harvey, were irrelevant background noise. What makes this erasure particularly insidious is that it worked both ways. As Europe colonized the Islamic world, they didn't just dismiss contemporary Muslim societies as backward, they also colonized the past. They claimed the achievements of Islamic civilization as actually belonging to the classical tradition that Europeans were the true heirs to. Greek knowledge had been preserved by Muslims, yes, but only preserved, not advanced, not revolutionized, just kept warm until the rightful owners came back for it. This is demonstrably false. Islamic scholars didn't just preserve Greek texts, they tore them apart, tested them, corrected them, and often proved them wrong. Ptolemy's geography, corrected by Al-Idrisi; Galen's anatomy, challenged by Al-Razi; Aristotle's physics, critiqued and advanced by Ibn Sina. But acknowledging that would mean admitting that science isn't a uniquely Western project, that rational thought and empirical investigation aren't European inventions, that maybe, just maybe, the story of human progress is more complicated than the one painted in gilt-edged history books. The propaganda was remarkably effective. By the Victorian era, European scholars could write entire histories of science that mentioned Islamic civilization only in passing, usually in the context of preserving ancient knowledge during the Dark Ages. As if Muslim scholars spent 5 centuries in a library, dusting off scrolls, and waiting for Europeans to arrive and do something useful with them. As if the House of Wisdom was a museum, not a research institution. As if translation was passive reception, not active interpretation and advancement. Even the geography got rewritten. The Middle East became a term defined by its relationship to Europe, not the center of civilization, which it had been, not the crossroads of trade and ideas. Just the middle, somewhere between what mattered and what didn't. The Islamic world became the Orient, a vaguely exotic space where time moved differently, where progress had stalled, where people needed Western intervention to join modernity. This narrative required ignoring some inconvenient facts, like the fact that when European crusaders arrived in the Levant, they found cities with running water, hospitals, and libraries while their own capitals were still figuring out sewage, or that Islamic law had concepts of institutional endowments and charitable trusts that influenced European legal systems, or that the agricultural revolution that transformed medieval Europe was based on crops and techniques imported from the Islamic world. Citrus fruits, rice, cotton, sugar, advanced irrigation, all from Muslim lands. But the story became about European innovation, not Islamic transfer. What's most striking is how this revisionism persists. Modern textbooks have gotten better, mostly. They'll mention Islamic contributions in a dedicated section, usually brief, but the overall narrative remains unchanged. Science begins with the Greeks, disappears for a while, the specifics are hazy, then returns with Copernicus and the scientific revolution. The Islamic Golden Age becomes a curiosity, not a central chapter, an interesting sidebar, not the main event. This matters because history shapes how we see the present. If science is inherently Western, then non-Western societies doing science are either imitating the West or tapping into their own ancient traditions that somehow skipped the medieval period entirely. The actual continuity, the direct line from Islamic scholarship to European universities to modern science, gets lost. We end up with a fragmented story where the connections have been deliberately severed. And it's not like this information is hidden in obscure archives. Scholars have been documenting Islamic contributions for decades. The research exists, the primary sources survive. We have the Arabic manuscripts, many of them. We can trace the translations, track the transmission, prove the influence. But academic knowledge and popular understanding are different things. Most people still learn the old story, and the old story is sticky. Part of the problem is that correcting this narrative feels like taking something away from Europe, as if acknowledging Islamic achievements somehow diminishes European ones. But that's not how knowledge works. Science isn't a zero-sum game where giving credit to Al-Khwarizmi means taking it from Newton. They built on each other. That's the whole point. That's how human understanding advances. But colonial thinking created hierarchies, civilized and uncivilized, advanced and backward, contributors and beneficiaries. And once those hierarchies were established, they became self-reinforcing. If Muslims are backward now, they must have always been backward. If Europeans are advanced now, they must have always been the source of advancement. Any evidence to the contrary must be explained away or ignored. The irony is that Islamic scholars themselves preserved knowledge without erasing its sources. When they translated Greek texts, they acknowledged the authors. When they built on Indian mathematics, they credited it. The concept of the footnote, of citation, of building openly on previous work, that was part of Islamic scholarly practice. It was Europe that pioneered the art of selective amnesia. You can see this in how discoveries get renamed. The camera obscura, described in detail by Ibn al-Haytham in his Book of Optics, becomes a European invention when it appears in Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks. Never mind that Leonardo almost certainly learned about it from Latin translations of Arabic texts. The crankshaft, documented in Islamic engineering texts, becomes a European innovation. The windmill, developed to Persian designs, becomes Dutch. Even coffee, originally cultivated in Yemen and spread by Muslim merchants, gets rebranded as a European cafe culture phenomenon. This wasn't malicious conspiracy. It was cultural self-centeredness amplified by power. The people writing the histories were European. The people funding the research were European. The people deciding what counted as important were European. So European contributions got highlighted, and everything else faded into background. Not through deliberate lies, usually, but through emphasis and omission, through what questions got asked and what questions didn't. And once that narrative was established, challenging it became professionally risky. Scholars who emphasized Islamic contributions were accused of political correctness or reverse discrimination, as if accurately describing history was somehow unfair to Europeans, as if the truth needed to be balanced against national pride. But history isn't about making anyone feel good. It's about understanding what actually happened. And what actually happened is that human knowledge is cumulative, cross-cultural, and built by people whose names we should remember, not as a political statement, just as fact. The House of Wisdom burned, but the ideas didn't. They traveled west in Latin translations and east to Persia and India. They shaped universities and inspired scholars and became the foundation of modern science. Erasing the names didn't erase the influence. It just made the story harder to follow. And that's where things get interesting. Because once you start pulling that thread, once you begin questioning what else got written out of history, the whole tapestry starts to unravel. So you start digging, not through ruins, but through footnotes, through the citations in medieval European texts that everyone glosses over, through the acknowledgements that got quietly dropped in later editions, through the Arabic names that got Latinized so thoroughly they became unrecognizable. And you find something remarkable. The Islamic Golden Age didn't just contribute to one or two fields, it revolutionized nearly every branch of human knowledge. Medicine, astronomy, mathematics, chemistry, physics, geography, philosophy. The scope is staggering, and the silence around it equally so. Take medicine. When European physicians were still balancing humors and prescribing leeches based on astrological charts, Islamic hospitals were conducting clinical trials, actual systematic testing of treatments. Al-Razi, known in the West as Razes, wrote medical encyclopedias so comprehensive they were used in European universities for 6 centuries. 6 centuries. He described diseases like smallpox and measles with such precision that his observations remained definitive into the modern era. He advocated for experimental medicine, for testing hypotheses rather than just accepting ancient authorities. Ibn Sina, Avicenna in Latin, wrote the Canon of Medicine around 1025. It became the standard medical textbook across Europe and the Islamic world. It covered everything from anatomy to pharmacology to surgical techniques. European medical students were studying Ibn Sina's work at the same time their culture was telling them Muslims were barbaric and backward. The cognitive dissonance apparently wasn't an issue. But here's what's fascinating. These weren't just compilations of earlier Greek knowledge. They were expansions, corrections, Innovations. Ibn Sina identified tuberculosis as contagious, something European medicine wouldn't accept for another 6 centuries. Al-Zahrawi, known as Abul Qasis, invented over 200 surgical instruments, many of which are still used today in modified form. He pioneered techniques in neurosurgery, ophthalmology, and obstetrics. His illustrated surgical manual was translated into Latin and became the foundation of European surgery. Islamic physicians understood that diseases spread through contamination. They built hospitals with separate wards for different conditions. They used anesthesia during surgery, mixing opium and other substances to manage pain. They documented case studies and treatment outcomes. This was evidence-based medicine centuries before Europe embraced the concept. Now shift to astronomy. Islamic astronomers didn't just preserve Ptolemy's work, they challenged it. They built observatories equipped with instruments of unprecedented precision. The observatory at Maragha in Persia had tools accurate to within minutes of arc. They tracked planetary movements, calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of the modern value, and developed models of planetary motion that questioned geocentric assumptions. Al-Battani's astronomical observations were so precise that Copernicus cited him by name, not in a footnote. In the main text, Copernicus, the man credited with the heliocentric revolution, explicitly built on Islamic astronomy. His models incorporated mathematical techniques developed by astronomers at Maragha. The connection is direct and documented. Yet somehow the narrative became Copernicus revolutionizing astronomy by rejecting medieval thought, as if Islamic contributions were part of that rejected medieval framework rather than the foundation he built on. Ibn al-Shatir, working in Damascus in the 1300s, developed a mathematical model of planetary motion that's almost identical to what Copernicus would propose 2 centuries later. Almost identical. Same geometric constructions, same mathematical relationships. There's no evidence Copernicus directly read Ibn al-Shatir's work, but the similarities are too precise to be coincidental. Ideas traveled, knowledge moved through trade routes and translations and conversations in Mediterranean ports. What gets really interesting is when you look at what Islamic scholars did with all this knowledge. They didn't just collect it, they systematized it. They created the scientific method before it had that name. Ibn al-Haytham's Book of Optics is basically a treatise on experimental methodology. He didn't just theorize about how vision works. He designed experiments. He built apparatus. He tested hypotheses systematically and discarded the ones that didn't match observations. His approach: observation, hypothesis, experimentation, analysis. That's the scientific method. He was doing it in the year 1000. Europeans eventually adopted this approach, but it took centuries. And when they did, the credit went to Francis Bacon and the Enlightenment, not to the Muslim polymath who'd articulated it 600 years earlier. Chemistry is another stunning example. The word itself comes from Arabic, alchemia. Islamic chemists, working in what were essentially the first real laboratories, developed techniques like distillation, crystallization, and sublimation. They isolated acids, created new compounds, and documented their methods with precision. Jabir ibn Hayyan described chemical processes so clearly that modern chemists can replicate them. These weren't alchemists chasing magical transformations, though that stereotype persists. They were systematically investigating the properties of matter. They developed equipment, glassware, furnaces, and measurement tools that became standard. When European chemistry emerged during the Renaissance, it used apparatus and techniques directly inherited from Islamic labs. But the histories of chemistry typically start with Robert Boyle in the 1600s, as if nothing substantive happened in the previous 6 centuries, as if the entire foundation of experimental chemistry materialized spontaneously in Europe without precedent. Geography and cartography tell a similar story. Islamic scholars didn't just copy Greek maps. They corrected them. Al-Idrisi, working in Sicily in the 11th century, created a world map so detailed and accurate it remained the best available for 3 centuries. He incorporated information from travelers, merchants, and explorers across the Islamic world. His map showed Africa, Asia, and Europe with remarkable precision, including details about climates, cultures, and resources. Islamic geographers understood Earth as a sphere. They calculated its circumference with impressive accuracy. They developed latitude and longitude systems. They created navigational instruments like the astrolabe, refined to such precision that European sailors depended on them for centuries. When Europeans began their age of exploration, they used Islamic maps, Islamic navigational tools, and knowledge compiled by Islamic geographers. Columbus carried a Latin translation of Al-Farghani's astronomical tables. Magellan's expedition relied on improved versions of the astrolabe. The tools of European exploration were Islamic innovations. Yet the narrative of discovery credits European courage and innovation, rarely mentioning the instruments and knowledge that made those voyages possible. Mathematics deserves its own examination because the debt is so enormous and so ignored. Algebra, obviously, but also trigonometry. Islamic mathematicians developed spherical trigonometry to solve problems in astronomy and navigation. They created trigonometric tables of extraordinary accuracy. They proved theorems and developed formulas that became fundamental to physics and engineering. Al-Kashi calculated pi to 16 decimal places in the 1400s. 16. Using techniques that wouldn't be improved upon for 200 years. His work on decimals and numerical approximation laid groundwork for calculus, though he rarely gets mentioned in that history. And here's something that should be taught in every math class but isn't. The concept of the algorithm, the step-by-step procedure for solving problems, comes directly from Al-Khwarizmi. His name became the word. When medieval European scholars Latinized his name to Algorithmi, they turned him into a methodology. Every time a computer runs an algorithm, it's echoing a 9th century Persian mathematician's approach to systematic problem solving. But how many computer science students know that? How many programmers realize the fundamental concept underlying all of computing has an Arabic name and an Islamic origin? Philosophy and theology also flourished, though these contributions get even less attention. Islamic philosophers grappled with questions of reason and faith, free will and determinism, the nature of reality and knowledge. Averroes, Ibn Rushd, wrote commentaries on Aristotle so influential that European scholastics called him simply the commentator. Thomas Aquinas, the foundational figure of Christian theology, built his arguments in explicit dialogue with Averroes, agreeing, disagreeing, but always engaging. Al-Ghazali wrote philosophical and theological works that shaped Islamic thought and influenced Christian and Jewish philosophy. Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher, wrote in Arabic and engaged deeply with Islamic philosophical traditions. The medieval world was intellectually interconnected in ways the later narrative of civilizational conflict obscures. These weren't isolated geniuses working in vacuum. They were part of institutions, universities, libraries, observatories, hospitals. The Islamic world built infrastructure for knowledge production. It created systems for training scholars, funding research, and disseminating discoveries. It treated intellectual work as valuable, even sacred. The pursuit of knowledge was a religious obligation, not a secular luxury. That infrastructure is what made the Golden Age possible, and its destruction is what ended it. Not because Islam suddenly became incompatible with science, as some modern narratives suggest, but because the institutions were destroyed, the libraries burned, the observatories were abandoned, the funding dried up, the political stability that enabled scholarship collapsed. When you understand the scope of what was lost, the burning of the House of Wisdom becomes more than symbolic. It represents the destruction of an entire knowledge ecosystem, not just books, but the culture that produced them. And what makes this doubly tragic is that Europe inherited the fruits without acknowledging the tree. The knowledge survived, translated and transmitted, but the credit didn't. The names were changed or forgotten. The contributions were absorbed into a narrative that positioned Europe as the sole wellspring of progress. That theft of intellectual heritage isn't ancient history. It shapes what we teach, what we value, and who we recognize as contributors to human knowledge. It creates a distorted map of how we got here. The intellectual debt runs deeper than most people realize. When European universities began forming in the 12th and 13th centuries, they didn't build their curriculum from scratch. They imported it. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, these institutions were founded on translated Arabic texts, not Greek texts, Arabic ones, because the Greeks had been filtered through Islamic scholarship, commented on, corrected, expanded. When medieval European students studied medicine, they used Avicenna's canon. When they learned astronomy, they relied on Islamic observational tables. When they studied optics, they read Al-Razi. The foundation of European education was built on Islamic intellectual work. And yet the story we tell erases this dependency. We talk about the Renaissance as if Europe suddenly remembered the Greeks all by itself, as if the texts just appeared, untouched, waiting to be rediscovered. That's not what happened. Islamic scholars preserved those texts, yes, but they also corrected them, critiqued them, built upon them. Aristotle was better understood in 13th century Baghdad than in 4th century Athens because Islamic philosophers had spent 400 years working through his arguments, finding his errors, extending his logic. Europe didn't inherit pure Greek knowledge. It inherited improved Greek knowledge with Islamic upgrades. The translation movement itself deserves more recognition. For centuries, Toledo in Spain became a hub where Arabic texts were systematically translated into Latin. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked together. They created the intellectual bridge that made the European Renaissance possible. Without those translators, Europe would have remained in what we patronizingly call the Dark Ages for much longer. But how many people can name a single translator from Toledo? How many history courses even mention this collaborative effort? What's particularly galling is how the narrative shifted once Europe caught up. By the 16th century, European scholars had absorbed enough to start producing original work again, and the moment they did, the story changed. Suddenly, it became about European genius, European innovation, European superiority. The Islamic contributions got downgraded to mere preservation, as if keeping knowledge alive for 800 years, improving it, expanding it, and teaching it to others was somehow less important than what came after. This revisionism had real consequences. It created a hierarchy of civilizations that justified colonialism. If Europe was the sole source of progress, then European domination of the Islamic world could be framed as bringing civilization to backwards peoples. Never mind that those peoples had been Europe's teachers for centuries. The intellectual theft enabled political theft. The narrative justified the conquest. But here's what really happened to end the Islamic Golden Age. It wasn't Islam. It wasn't some inherent incompatibility between faith and reason. It was invasion, destruction, and the collapse of the institutions that made scholarship possible. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century were catastrophic. When Hulagu Khan's forces took Baghdad in 1258, they destroyed everything: the House of Wisdom, libraries, schools, observatories. Accounts say the Tigris River ran black with ink from all the books thrown into it. Scholars were killed. The infrastructure of knowledge production was systematically demolished. And that wasn't the only blow. The Crusades disrupted trade routes and intellectual exchange. Internal political fragmentation weakened the centralized patronage that had funded scholarly work. Religious conservatives gained influence, arguing that the pursuit of natural philosophy distracted from spiritual matters. Not because Islam inherently opposed science, but because in times of crisis, people often turn inward, become defensive, prioritize survival over inquiry. But even after these disasters, Islamic scholarship didn't completely stop. It shifted, adapted, continued in different forms and places. The Ottoman Empire produced important work in astronomy and mathematics. Safavid Persia had scholarly centers. Mughal India blended Islamic and Hindu intellectual traditions. The story isn't simply rise and fall. It's more complicated, more interesting, and it extends into periods we're taught to think of as purely European. What we're left with today is a massive gap in historical literacy. Most educated people in the West can name Greek philosophers, Renaissance artists, Enlightenment thinkers. But ask them to name a single Islamic Golden Age scholar, and you'll get blank stares. Maybe they've heard of Avicenna if they studied medieval medicine, maybe Al-Khwarizmi if they dug deep into math history. But the vast majority of these figures, people who shaped human knowledge as fundamentally as anyone in the Western canon, remain unknown. This ignorance isn't neutral. It shapes how we view the Islamic world today. When you don't know that Baghdad was once the intellectual center of the world, you're more likely to accept narratives that position the Middle East as perpetually backwards. When you don't know that Islamic scholars pioneered the scientific method, you're more susceptible to arguments that Islam is somehow incompatible with modernity. The historical erasure enables contemporary prejudice, and it deprives us of useful models. Right now, when we talk about the relationship between religion and science, we act as if there's only one template, the European Enlightenment model where progress required secularization, where reason had to defeat faith. But the Islamic Golden Age offers a different model, one where religious devotion and scientific inquiry reinforced each other, where scholars saw understanding God's creation as a form of worship, where the pursuit of knowledge was a spiritual obligation. That model might not solve all our contemporary tensions, but it at least proves they're not inevitable. The recovery of this history matters practically too. When you trace modern mathematics back to its roots, you find techniques we still use daily came from Islamic scholars solving practical problems. Banking, trade, architecture, navigation. These weren't abstract exercises. They were tools for building civilization. And the Islamic world built remarkably sophisticated civilizations. Cities with running water and street lighting, while European cities wallowed in mud. Legal systems that balanced religious law with practical governance. Economic networks that spanned 3 continents. These weren't primitive societies waiting for Europe to enlighten them. They were advanced, complex, successful on their own terms. So what should be done with this knowledge? First, obviously, teach it, not as a footnote, not as a special topic, but as a central part of the story of human intellectual development. When you teach the scientific method, teach Al-Hazen. When you teach algebra, teach Al-Khwarizmi. When you teach medicine, teach Avicenna and Al-Razi. Make these names as familiar as Galileo and Newton, because they deserve to be. Second, recognize the continuities. Stop teaching history as if civilizations exist in isolated bubbles. Knowledge flowed between cultures. Islamic scholars built on Greek, Indian, and Persian foundations. European scholars built on Islamic foundations. Chinese innovations influenced everyone. The story of human progress is a story of exchange, collaboration, and yes, sometimes theft, but it's fundamentally interconnected. Third, understand what was lost and why. The destruction of the Islamic Golden Age wasn't inevitable. It resulted from specific political and military catastrophes catastrophes, and it represents a loss not just for the Islamic world but for all of humanity. How much further might we be if those institutions had survived? What discoveries were never made because the scholars who could have made them were killed? What books were never written because the libraries that would have held them were burned? Those aren't idle questions. They point to something we still struggle with: the fragility of knowledge, the ease with which it can be destroyed, the importance of the institutions and stability that make intellectual work possible. When we underfund universities, when we burn books literally or figuratively, when we attack expertise and scholarship, we're repeating the mistakes that ended the Islamic Golden Age. The methods change, but the pattern remains. And finally, this history offers a corrective to the dangerous idea that civilizations are fundamentally incompatible, that the West and Islam are locked in some eternal conflict. The reality is far messier and more hopeful. For centuries, these traditions learned from each other. Scholars crossed religious boundaries to collaborate. Knowledge flowed in all directions. The conflict narrative is recent, constructed, and serves political purposes, but it's not inevitable, and it's not supported by the historical record. The Islamic Golden Age doesn't belong only to Muslims or only to the Middle East. It belongs to human history. The scholars who worked in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba were solving universal problems. Their discoveries aren't Islamic mathematics or Islamic astronomy. They're just mathematics and astronomy, part of the common inheritance of humanity. Recognizing that doesn't diminish anyone's achievements. It acknowledges reality. What makes the erasure particularly frustrating is how unnecessary it is. There's no good reason for this ignorance. The information exists. The sources are available. The scholarship has been done. What's missing is the will to change the narrative, to complicate the simple story of Western supremacy with the more interesting truth of global intellectual exchange. That change is starting to happen. More scholars are working on this period. More books are being written. More courses are being taught. But it's slow. Too slow compared to the pace at which the erasure happened. And it's not just about correcting textbooks. It requires rethinking how we tell the story of progress itself. Because here's the uncomfortable part. The narrative we've inherited isn't just incomplete. It's designed to justify specific power structures. When European empires colonized the Middle East and North Africa, they needed a story that explained why they had the right to do so. The story they told was one of civilizational hierarchy. Europeans were advanced, rational, scientific. The people they were conquering were backwards, superstitious, stagnant. To make that story work, they had to erase centuries of Islamic intellectual achievement. They had to pretend that nothing of value happened between ancient Greece and the European Renaissance. They literally called it the Dark Ages, as if the lights went out across the entire world. But the lights didn't go out, they just moved. And when European scholars finally encountered Islamic texts, they didn't acknowledge the debt. They repackaged the knowledge as their own rediscovery of ancient wisdom, skipping over the centuries of development that had actually occurred. This wasn't accidental, it was ideological. The erasure served a purpose, and that purpose still shapes how history gets taught today, long after the formal empires have ended. Which brings us to a question that matters right now. What does it mean to live in a world built partly on stolen knowledge that refuses to acknowledge the theft? It means we're operating with a distorted map. We think we understand how we got here, but we're missing crucial information, and that has consequences. It affects how we approach current conflicts, how we think about immigration and integration, how we fund research and education, how we imagine the future. If you believe that one civilization has a monopoly on reason and progress, you'll make very different choices than if you understand that innovation has always been global, collaborative, messy. Consider what happens when students from Muslim backgrounds learn science and mathematics in schools that never mention Islamic contributions to those fields. What message does that send? That their ancestors contributed nothing, that they're inheriting someone else's tradition rather than reclaiming part of their own? The psychological impact of that erasure is real. It contributes to alienation, to the sense that science and modernity are Western impositions rather than shared human achievements. And that's not just unfortunate, it's actively harmful, because we need everyone's contributions to solve the problems we're facing. Climate change, pandemics, artificial intelligence, all the challenges that will define this century require global cooperation and the full participation of every culture and tradition. We can't afford to keep half the world's population on the sidelines because we're too attached to a myth of singular Western genius. The Islamic Golden Age proves that intellectual flourishing isn't tied to any one culture or religion. It happens when certain conditions align: political stability, economic prosperity, institutional support, cultural openness, tolerance for disagreement. Those conditions existed in the medieval Islamic world. They've existed at different times in China, India, the Americas, Africa. They exist now in some places and not others. Understanding that should make us humble. There's nothing inevitable about progress, nothing guaranteed. The societies that seem most advanced can collapse. The centers of learning can be destroyed. The knowledge can be lost. And when we pretend otherwise, when we tell ourselves comforting stories about the inevitable march of Western civilization, we're setting ourselves up for catastrophe because we stop doing the things that actually make progress possible. We defund education, we attack expertise, we celebrate ignorance as authenticity, we turn knowledge into a political football, and then we wonder why things seem to be getting worse instead of better. The scholars of the Islamic Golden Age would recognize this pattern. They saw it happen in real time as their world fell apart, as the Mongols approached Baghdad, as the libraries burned, as the observatories were abandoned. They knew what they were losing, and they couldn't stop it. We have the advantage of hindsight. We can see what happened to them. We can learn from their example, both the positive and the negative. We can see what makes intellectual flourishing possible and what destroys it. The question is whether we'll actually learn those lessons or whether we'll keep telling ourselves comfortable lies. Here's what gives me some hope. The knowledge hasn't actually disappeared. It's been suppressed, marginalized, erased from popular narratives, but it still exists. The manuscripts are in libraries and museums. The scholarship has been done. The connections have been traced. All that's required is the decision to acknowledge it, to teach it, to make it part of the common story we tell about how we got here. That's not a radical demand. It's just accuracy, and increasingly people are demanding it. Students are asking why their textbooks skip from Greece to the Renaissance. Historians are writing accessible books that challenge the traditional narrative. Educators are developing curricula that reflect the actual history of human knowledge. The change is happening, just slowly, too slowly for the people whose heritage has been erased, but faster than it was even 20 years ago. What would it look like if this knowledge were common? If every educated person knew about Al-Khwarizmi and Al-Hasan the way they know about Newton and Galileo? If the Islamic Golden Age were taught as a central chapter in human history rather than a footnote? It would mean recognizing that the scientific revolution didn't come out of nowhere. It built on centuries of work by scholars across multiple civilizations. It would mean understanding that the Enlightenment values we claim to cherish, reason, empiricism, skepticism, have roots in multiple traditions, not just European ones. It would mean acknowledging that the modern world was built by everyone, not just by the West. And maybe most importantly, it would mean recognizing that we're still building it, that the next great discoveries might come from anywhere. That genius isn't distributed according to geography or religion or race, that we need to create the conditions for intellectual flourishing everywhere, not just in a few privileged centers. The Islamic Golden Age isn't just history. It's a reminder of what's possible when societies invest in knowledge, when they welcome scholars regardless of background, when they value learning for its own sake. And it's a warning about how quickly all of that can be destroyed. Both lessons matter. The scholars who worked in those medieval libraries and observatories didn't think of themselves as Islamic scholars or Arab scholars or Persian scholars. They thought of themselves as seekers of truth. They were trying to understand the world, and they built on whatever knowledge they could find, regardless of where it came from. That's the tradition we've inherited. Not a Western tradition or an Eastern one, but a human tradition. And the sooner we acknowledge that, the sooner we can get back to the actual work of building knowledge together, instead of fighting over who deserves credit for the past. Because here's the final thing worth remembering. The Islamic Golden Age ended, but the questions those scholars asked are still with us. How does vision work? What's the structure of the universe? How do diseases spread? What's the nature of mathematics? They made progress on all of these, but they didn't finish. No one generation ever does. The work continues. And it continues better when we remember everyone who contributed, when we acknowledge the full history, when we stop pretending that knowledge belongs to any one group. That's what's at stake in recovering this history. Not just accuracy, though that matters. Not just justice, though that matters too, but the future. The ability to imagine a world where everyone contributes, where knowledge flows freely, where we solve problems together instead of retreating into tribalism and myth. The Islamic Golden Age shows us that world is possible. We've done it before. We can do it again. The scholars working in Baghdad's House of Wisdom 900 years ago couldn't have predicted that their names would be systematically erased from history. They were too busy measuring the stars, isolating chemical compounds, and developing the mathematical tools that would eventually put humans on the moon. They didn't work for recognition. They worked because understanding the world was its own reward. But recognition matters anyway, not for the dead, who can't benefit from it, but for the living, for the students who deserve to know the full story, for the societies that need to understand their own contributions, for everyone who's been taught a version of history that's incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. What's remarkable about this erasure is how fragile it's turning out to be. The narrative held for centuries, but it's cracking now. Not because of some grand political movement, but because of simple questions. Students asking why the timeline jumps, researchers following footnotes to their sources, people noticing the Arabic names of stars and wondering why they're there. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually. You can bury it, ignore it, talk around it, but it doesn't disappear. The manuscripts are still in libraries. The mathematical proofs still work. The star catalogues are still accurate. The medical observations still hold up. The evidence exists, and it's not going anywhere. What changes is our willingness to look at it honestly, to admit that the story we inherited was constructed for specific purposes, many of them political, to recognize that acknowledging Islamic contributions doesn't diminish anyone else's achievements. It just makes the picture complete. And that complete picture is actually more interesting than the simplified version, because it shows how knowledge really develops, not through isolated geniuses having spontaneous breakthroughs, but through networks of scholars building on each other's work across centuries and continents. Greek ideas refined in India, transmitted through Persia, expanded in Baghdad, translated in Toledo, taught in Paris, applied in London, sent back to Cairo in new forms. That's the actual pattern. That's how human understanding grows. The Islamic Golden Age isn't just missing history. It's a working model of what intellectual flourishing requires. Institutional support, yes. Political stability, certainly. But also openness to foreign ideas. Willingness to question received wisdom. Investment in translation and transmission. Respect for expertise. Protection for scholars. Funding for research that might not have immediate, practical applications. Those conditions are hard to create and easy to destroy. The Mongols proved that in 1258, but so did the European colonizers who dismissed existing scholarship as primitive. So did the dictators who purged universities. So do we, every time we defund education, or attack expertise, or turn science into a political wedge issue. The scholars of Baghdad couldn't save their libraries from the Mongols, but we can learn from what they built and what they lost. We can choose to create the conditions for knowledge to flourish, rather than the conditions for it to burn. We can teach the full history instead of the edited version. We can acknowledge that we're all inheritors of a tradition that belongs to everyone. That's not idealism, it's pragmatism, because the problems we're facing require the full participation of everyone, not just the people whose contributions got written into the standard narrative. Climate change doesn't care about civilizational hierarchies. Pandemics don't respect cultural boundaries. The challenges ahead will require the best thinking from every tradition, every culture, every corner of human experience. And we can't access that thinking if half the world's population grows up believing their ancestors contributed nothing to human knowledge. If students learn science as something invented by and for the West, rather than as a universal human endeavor. If we keep pretending that genius is the exclusive property of one civilization. The Islamic Golden Age proves otherwise. It proves that brilliance emerges wherever the conditions support it. That innovation happens when knowledge circulates freely. That progress requires building on what came before, regardless of who built it. Those 9th century scholars measuring the circumference of the earth, those 10th century physicians documenting disease transmission, those 11th century mathematicians developing algebra, they were doing the same work we're doing now. Trying to understand how things work, trying to solve problems, trying to leave the world a little more comprehensible than they found it. Their names should be as familiar as any in the scientific canon, not as a gesture of political correctness, but as a simple acknowledgement of fact. They earned their place in history. The only question is whether we'll finally give it to them, and whether we'll learn from their example, both from their achievements and from how quickly everything they built could be destroyed. Because knowledge isn't self-sustaining. It requires constant effort, constant investment, constant protection. The moment we stop valuing it, stop teaching it, stop creating the conditions for it to grow, we risk losing it. The House of Wisdom burned 900 years ago. The question facing us now is whether we'll build institutions that can last, or whether we'll let ours burn too, just more slowly and with less dramatic flames. The answer to that question will determine not just what history we teach, but what future we build. The scholars are still there in the archives, waiting to be acknowledged. The knowledge is still there, waiting to be taught. The only thing missing is our willingness to tell the truth about where it came from. And that's a choice we make every time we open a textbook, plan a curriculum, or tell a story about how we got here. The choice to include everyone, or to keep pretending that human knowledge has borders. 900 years is a long time to wait for recognition, but the truth doesn't have an expiration date. It's still true whether we acknowledge it or not. The only question is, how much longer we'll pretend otherwise?